If I were to ask you to name a famous war, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it World War II? World War II? Or perhaps World War II? Unsurprisingly, the Second World War tends to dominate public attention more than any other conflict, which you can clearly see in the sheer amount of media centered around it. I mean, just think about how many documentaries there are about this guy. That's not to say people never think about the First World War. Far from it. Some of the most famous pieces of media ever made are set during the Great War. Usually they focus on the horrors of war, although there is also that novel turned play turned film about the zoophilic relationship between a man and a horse. Conscript, while far less famous, is no less effective at portraying those horrors. Before we begin, however, we must first go back to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to waste your time on that. I'm just going to assume you already know about World War I, and if you don't, there are plenty of videos, articles, and books that explain it far better than I ever could. Besides, the causes of the war are mostly irrelevant to what the game is actually about. World War I is usually remembered as murder committed on an industrial scale. Artillery barrages, machine guns, chemical weapons, all used to kill and maim thousands indiscriminately. But for the people trapped inside it, trench warfare was intimate. There's nothing industrial about beating someone to death with an improvised club or driving a trench knife into them and watching the life drain from them. And that intimacy is what Conscript focuses on. The fact the game takes place during the Battle of Verdun matters less for the military details and more for what Verdun represents. Exhaustion, hopelessness, and death on a colossal scale. From the perspective of the individual soldier, all of that suffering starts to feel senseless. Any grand justification for the conflict matters little when your immediate concerns are surviving the next trench raid and desperately trying not to drown in the mud. And Conscript explores that perspective through one man in particular, Andre. When we first take control of Andre, we're immediately thrown into the thick of it. A German assault on the trenches is imminent. Of course, that isn't Andre's primary concern. He's worried about his brother Pierre, so he heads out to Fort Souville to find him. Now, I could spend time talking about the gameplay. It's a solid Resident Evil-like survival horror game with puzzles, resource management, and confined spaces. But that's not what stuck with me. What stuck with me was the atmosphere. As you make your way through the trenches and dugouts, one thing becomes immediately clear. This place feels dead. Everything is muddy. The colors are dull and lifeless. Most locations carry this same atmosphere, only the scenery changes. The worst are the places where you can still tell life used to exist before the war left its mark. For example, later in the game you pass through a ruined town filled with bombed out buildings, and eventually the entire place is engulfed in flames. There aren't many images that better capture the phrase hell on earth. All of these visuals do an excellent job at portraying the physical devastation of war. What makes this even more impressive is that the game was developed by a single person, Jordan Mochi, who's incredibly adept at environmental storytelling and presentation. The visuals not only portray environmental destruction, but reflects the psychological state of people forced to survive within it, especially Andre. From Chapter 2 onwards, each chapter begins with flashbacks where you explore Andre's home shortly before conscription. These memories are filled with color and warmth in stark contrast to the dead wasteland of Verdun. You immediately get the sense that the war has hollowed something out inside Andre. The soundtrack is never intrusive, but it's always perfectly suited to the moment, whether the scene calls for tension, horror, or even silence. But it's at its best when the game leans into tragedy. Most of the soundtrack is composed by Sonny Augusti and mixed and mastered by Jim Rindfleisch, with one exception. One of the save room tracks was composed by Survival Spheres, who specialize in Resident Evil style save room music, and you can really feel that influence here. The track perfectly captures that classic Resident Evil feeling that you're safe for now, but the moment you step back outside, the horror continues. So no, you can't stay in here forever. The war doesn't stop just because you found somewhere safe. So, back into the trenches we go. Welcome to Verdun. Imagine this. You enter a room and suddenly a chemical weapon detonates behind you, blocking the exit. Unfortunately, you don't have your gas mask with you. As the gas slowly fills the room, you spot another soldier at the far end wearing one. He's bleeding out. You have a choice. He will not return. You're placed into an impossible situation where survival means taking the life of another soldier. This is what Conscript does best: storytelling. Much like the presentation, Jordan Mochi uses environments, gameplay situations, and implication to communicate the horror of war without constantly spelling things out to the player. So much of his storytelling comes from showing rather than telling. A great example of this is the numerous photographs you can find on dead German soldiers. In many cases, enemies you kill will drop pictures of loved ones or things that were clearly important to them. They were ordinary people with lives beyond the trenches, not just faceless enemies. One of the most poignant examples of this isn't even a photograph of a person. At one point during the 3rd chapter, you need to enter a stable that's been flooded with gas. Naturally, there are several dead horses lying inside. In one corner of the stable, a German soldier is having a complete mental breakdown. If you kill this soldier, he drops a photograph of a horse, and if you look carefully, there's also a dead horse lying right beside him. The game never explicitly explains what happened here, but the implication is enough for your mind to start filling in the blanks. Maybe this dead horse is the horse in the photograph, or maybe seeing the dead horse reminded him of it. The story here is told more by what has been omitted than by direct exposition. Unfortunately, war doesn't always leave much room for empathy. During the 3rd chapter, you encounter a German prisoner of war who asks you to retrieve a picture for him. When you find it, you can see it's a photograph of a woman. Returning it to him earns you his thanks. Later on during the 4th chapter, you return to the starting trenches. If you enter one of the old save rooms, this happens. Needless to say, this completely caught me off guard. It's a sneaky trick by the dev to utilize a place that is supposed to be safe to get the jump on you. Just goes to show that nowhere is truly safe in the trenches. After killing the knight, he drops a photograph. The exact same photograph you returned to the German POW earlier. Honestly, I was genuinely angry when this happened. It felt like a betrayal. But then again, how angry could I really be? It's impossible to know why he attacked Andre. Maybe he was ordered to. In an era where soldiers could be executed for cowardice or disobeying orders, he may simply have been doing what he needed to survive. Maybe he didn't even recognize Andre given how dark it was. And now, whoever was in that photograph will never see him return home. Not that returning home would guarantee you return in one piece. This is highlighted during the 5th chapter when you pass through the ruined town. Inside one of the buildings is a prosthetics workshop. At the back of the shop, you can find a note explaining that they're no longer accepting new requests for prosthetics. And if that wasn't grim enough, you can also find the craftsman's journal in the back room, where he describes being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of disfigured soldiers returning from the war. He even mentions needing to move his bed into the workshop, something you can actually see in-game. That small environmental detail is excellent storytelling. Not only does the environment reflect what's written in the journal, it quietly communicates that this man's entire life has been consumed by endless work for an endless stream of broken men. And with the town itself, how many soldiers came from places like this that have now been reduced to ruins? How many no longer even have a home to return to? There are signs that people once lived here, mostly through scattered notes and journals. But what matters most is who isn't here anymore, particularly the children. There's no children anywhere, and a place without children is a place without a future. Now, if you haven't played the game yet, this is your cue to stop here, because from this point onward, we're getting into spoilers. This game is actually very simple when it comes to the story. Andre starts out searching for his brother Pierre, and pretty much continues doing that until the end of the game. But honestly, I don't think this simplicity is a bad thing, because the story's straightforward structure makes it much easier to inhabit Andre's perspective and absorb the atmosphere of Verdun itself. When the only real objectives are survival and finding Pierre, it leaves a lot more room to reflect on everything else the setting is communicating. And that's not to say this story lacks thematic importance either. In fact, a lot of its more meaningful moments are easy to overlook. For example, there are the flashback sequences at the beginning of every chapter from chapter 2 onwards. You get a very good glimpse into Andre's home life. They seem to have lived in a fairly idyllic homestead. If you have a look around, you can see a few important details. One of the first things you'll notice is that their father has passed away and only their mother remains. There's also quite a lot of military equipment in prominent places, like this medal in Andre and Pierre's room, or their grandfather's rifle and saber in the front room. All of this implies their family has a proud military tradition. You can also find this pocket watch, the significance of which is explained in one of the many hidden journal entries you can find in the basement in each flashback scene. The watch once belonged to their father, and their mother has tried to convince Pierre that it's a good luck charm. It doesn't sound like he's completely convinced, but he does take it with him anyway to the front line. It's interesting to think about what kind of ideas and objects families leave behind for future generations. Objects like these are only ever as meaningful as the stories passed down alongside them. It makes you wonder whether Andre and Pierre will ever get the chance to pass these stories and objects down themselves. At the very least, you have to wonder if they'll still have such a reverence for military service afterward. The most striking detail, at least in my opinion, is the painting hanging above the fireplace. It depicts a small house surrounded by forest. I have absolutely no proof of this, but I genuinely wonder whether it's meant to be a painting of their home, and if that's the case, who painted it? Given its placement in the study and the subject matter itself, I can't help but wonder whether it was painted by a member of the family. It's unlikely to have been painted by Pierre, since the sketches in his journal aren't nearly as good by comparison. This is one of those small details that's easy to miss if you don't spend time looking around carefully, and interestingly enough, it becomes very important for one of the endings later on. Going back to the journal entries, one of them is especially revealing about Pierre's mentality toward the war before enlisting. He comes across as painfully naive, but then again, he's basically still a child, considering he lied about his age to join Andre at the front. At one point, he writes that the war is surely a better time than being stuck at home. Yeah, I don't think so. It's tragic that he was so eager to follow Andre into the war without truly understanding what the conflict would ultimately do to him. Speaking of which, let's get back to our journey of finding Pierre. By the 4th chapter, Andre is eventually ordered to participate in a forward assault. Before we're able to do that though, we first need to make our way back to the front line. So, let's go. I'm not gonna lie, that scared the shit out of me. Honestly, it got me even worse than the first ambush for some reason. It made me realize the game had successfully conditioned me into panicking whenever I opened a suspicious door. Thankfully, Marcel bails us out this time. You encounter him a few times throughout the game, but this is definitely the moment where I appreciated him the most. He even leaves behind supplies and a gun for you afterward. He's such a bro. It doesn't take long before you run into Marcel again. By the time you reach the front line for the Ford assault, he's already there waiting for you with a place in a trench reserved beside him. When you join him, you get this cinematic. As you can probably tell from Andre's trembling, this is a horrifying experience for him. Unfortunately, there isn't much room for fear down here. Whether it's ordinary fear or shell shock, it risks being seen as cowardice. And as you can see, the military has no use for so-called cowards. You have to wonder how all-consuming the fear of battle must be for it to override your immediate fear of being executed by your own commanding officer. It's yet another example of how this war forced men into situations where they could end up dying at the hands of their own side. The cinematic also reveals that Andre carries a photograph of someone important to him. In fact, if you look closely, you can see this photograph in the inventory screen throughout the game. It reinforces the idea that all those dead soldiers dropping photographs weren't so different from Andre after all. And then there's the bullet. I don't know if this is intentional, but I find it symbolically interesting that Andre holds the bullet while looking at the photograph. The photograph is a reminder of his life before the war. The bullet is everything that his future has become. And that future comes fast when the officer blows the whistle to commence the attack. I find this scene very disturbing in how unsentimental it is. Marcel crumples and falls like any other soldier in the game. Just one more among countless men already killed. Whatever attachment you might have formed matters little in the face of having to continue the frontal assault. There is no time to stop and consider what has happened. And the real horror is how universal this kind of death must have been. Men who loved and were loved, disappearing without ceremony because the battle simply carried on without them. Okay, so far I hope I've done a convincing enough job showing how great this game is at thematic storytelling. But if there's one area where I think the game falls short, it's this. There are several moments throughout the game where you encounter legless soldiers desperately crawling toward you and calling for a medic. The first time this happened, I was genuinely horrified. But the last few times I saw it, I laughed. The issue is that every instance reuses the exact same model, behavior, and voice line, to the point where it starts to feel like the same soldier appearing everywhere. Obviously, that isn't what the game intends. These are meant to be different men. The game deliberately presents most soldiers on both sides as generic, which helps to reinforce how universal the experience of war was for everyone involved. Unfortunately, these wounded soldiers are so identical in appearance and behavior that their repeated appearances become unintentionally hilarious and end up breaking the tension of a few otherwise powerful scenes. With that being said, I do think the game succeeds at showing something important. Fighting can be too much to bear for some men. It can be too much for Andre as well. In every forced engagement, you're given the option to abandon your post. For example, early on in this assault, you can find a trapdoor inside one of the buildings where you can hide until the fighting ends. Here you can literally watch Andre cower in fear. When it's over, you climb back out only to see all the bodies left behind. A reminder that you weren't there to support your fellow brothers in arms. The choice of whether to fight or abandon your station matters, because it directly influences which ending you receive. This brings us to the endings, where Conscript starts to reveal what it's actually been building towards. If there's any place where the narrative is at its strongest, it's the endings. In every ending, you finally find Pierre deep within Fort Vaux. He's badly injured, but just like during the opening battle, you can't attend to him immediately. The Germans are preparing to storm the fort, and once again you're forced to fight. It seems that on the battlefield, violence takes precedence even over your own flesh and blood. There are 4 endings with 2 variations for the first 3, depending on whether you complete a specific objective. In the B route, you ignore that objective and end up fighting the final battle completely alone. They invariably end in the death of your brother, as there is no one to help you care for him. In the A route, you need to retrieve a bird cage and several keys before eventually taking a carrier pigeon from a coop later in the game. You then release the pigeon in order to call reinforcements for the final battle. This is the only way to save Pierre. Just goes to show that sometimes survival depends on communication. Unfortunately, his survival comes at the cost of his leg. But better a limp brother than a dead brother, right? The A route also has you fighting alongside fellow soldiers, and your commanding officer even gives you an experimental grenade launcher. How's that for camaraderie? For ending 1, you need to abandon the very last battle. On the A route, it looks like the reinforcements evacuated your brother, so at least Pierre survives. In the B route, you are forced to take the most drastic action in order to spare your brother a horrible death. In either route, you're trapped in a tunnel. The ending text implies that Andre is never recovered. One particularly distressing detail is that the ending text describes men trapped in the forts of Verdun, surviving by licking moisture that collected on the cool tunnel walls. This strongly implies Andre dies slowly of starvation in the darkness. The game doesn't seem interested in arguing that Andre deserved this. If anything, it feels more like a reminder that in war, there are situations where refusing to fight doesn't protect you or the people you care about. In order to get ending 2, you need to abandon your post in every forced battle except for the final one. Sometimes violence may be necessary depending on the circumstances. If you can't fight for your brother, then who can you fight for? I think the game is suggesting that even if the wider context of the war feels meaningless, there are still individual moments where fighting matters. And rather than portraying Andre as a violent man for doing so, it portrays him as a peaceful man forced by circumstance into choosing violence. As a reward, Andre is executed by firing squad for cowardice in the earlier battles, despite putting up a valiant defense of Fort Vaux. Unfortunately, the military has very little interest in personal reasons. It doesn't take kindly to those who fight for family instead of the broader goals of the war, no matter how disconnected those goals are from the wants and needs of the individual soldier. Getting ending 3 requires that you fight every battle and kill as many enemies as possible. On your way to finding Pierre, you can find this room. If you're on the way to getting this ending, the room is on fire and filled to the brim with bodies. To contrast this, if you're getting the previous ending too, the room is completely empty and filled with a blue light. A very similar blue light as the save rooms. I love that the dev included this because you would never notice it unless you deliberately explored both outcomes. It makes the game feel more deliberate than it first appears. These details reward players who take the time to explore the different endings. After fighting in the final battle, Andre eventually finds himself in a hospital receiving a visit from his mother. When you reach Andre at the back of the hospital, you see his eyes. His blank eyes. You gotta wonder what his mother must feel when she sees her son's eyes and what they must have looked like before. Whatever the case may be, those eyes are long gone. The son left for the war and has returned. Whether he returned whole in mind and body is a completely different story. The scene eventually fades to black, only to come back with a hellish version of the hospital. You can control Andre and he's carrying Pierre. Everything is on fire. There's coffins and body bags. You can even find collections of photos that you would have come across from the German soldiers you killed throughout the game, as if to serve as a reminder of why you're here. When you get to the end, this happens. Of course, it was all a nightmare. It seems like Andre is just as traumatized by door ambushes as I am. Unfortunately, he's not done having nightmares just yet. Andre falls back asleep, only to find himself back in the trenches. If you haven't noticed, this is the exact scene that plays at the start of the game. The first nightmare uses much more blatant infernal imagery to suggest that Andre is trapped in a mental hell shaped by all the violence he participated in. The latter nightmare of waking back up in the trenches suggests something deeper. For Andre, the trenches is a much more personal hell, and he's forced to relive the war over and over again despite having left it. How many men returned home physically but never mentally left the trenches? We get a bit more insight into the legacy of the war in Ending 4. To get this ending, you first need to meet the requirements for Ending 3. Additionally, you need to release the pigeon and retrieve your grandfather's watch from Pierre's locker. These requirements are interesting in what they symbolize. As I suggested earlier, the pigeon implies communication while the watch implies inheritance. And who knows, maybe that watch really is lucky. To open Pierre's locker, you need to check his journal during the chapter flashbacks and pay attention to the drawings at the end of each entry. Those drawings determine the lock code and change every playthrough. The ending initially plays out exactly like Ending 3, but then adds one final section at the end. It's the 5th of May, 1940. We control Andre's son. Scattered around the house are journal entries written by the son that gives additional details about Andre's life after the war. The one in the study states that Andre and Pierre always argue when they see each other, suggesting some strong resentment between the two. It's understandable since they both suffered through the war, and sometimes people end up associating painful memories with the people who shared them. Additionally, you have to wonder if Pierre feels some resentment for having lost his leg, while Andre feels resentful for Pierre not being more grateful for saving him. Despite surviving the war together, their relationship never fully recovered. The journal goes on to explain that Pierre suffered permanent damage from the gas attacks before eventually revealing that he passed away. The most tragic part about this is that he had come over for dinner, and it was the first time in a long while that Andre and Pierre were happy together. For a moment, they probably forgot about the war, only for the effects of the war to snatch that happy moment away from them. If you look a little closer at the study, you can see that the piano that Pierre used to practice on has a cloth draped over it. The context message states that Andre hasn't touched it since Pierre passed away 7 years ago. Even though the war damaged their relationship, Andre never stopped loving his brother. The cruelest thing the war did to these brothers is not that it made them hate each other, but that it destroyed their ability to communicate their love for one another. Now, do you remember that painting above the fireplace that I mentioned earlier? The one with the house in the middle of the forest? Let's have a look at what replaced it. The first time I saw this painting, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I actually had a lump in my throat. It didn't hit me right away until I remembered that the painting was different. This was the moment I decided that I had to talk about this game. In many other games, this might feel a little cliche, but here it doesn't. For one, you have to go out of your way to see both paintings. It's not signposted and you're not directed to it, making it understated. Additionally, it visually closes off so many of the emotional themes present in the game. The forest present in the previous painting is burnt. The skies are dark. The house lies crumbled in ruins. That sense of peace represented by the original painting is completely gone. The war has destroyed whatever sense of peace Andre once had. Just as Andre did not come back whole, home no longer feels as it once did before the war. In one of the other journals, we learn that Pierre got drunk and explained how he lost his leg in the war, followed by nearly dying to the Spanish flu in 1919. He believed that the only reason he survived was because of the old pocket watch. It looks like Pierre eventually believed his mother's claims that the watch is a good luck charm. Pierre then gives it to Andre's son. By all accounts, it looks like Andre's son didn't want the watch in the first place since it was broken. Here we can see that the watch was successfully passed down to the next generation. Unfortunately, its significance was not. If you visit the basement, you'll actually find it stuffed in a box. It's been tucked away, no longer kept somewhere prominent or cherished. This pocket watch, which held so much significance for the older generations, has quietly fallen out of importance. This symbolizes how the values that once held the family together no longer carry the same meaning for the next generation. To emphasize this, you can check the other boxes and table. It was only here that I realized that all the military objects from the family's history that were kept in prominent places around the house in Andre's flashbacks are now stored away out of sight. If you look at the sword and rifle owned by Andre's grandfather, his son says that he thinks they belong to his great-grandfather. The fact that he's not certain of the ownership of these weapons shows that the pride once attached to the family's military history was never passed down to Andre's son, which implies something even more important. For earlier generations of this family, military service still seemed like something worth celebrating. For Andre and Pierre, the war was so damaging that even family military heirlooms seemed to become painful reminders rather than objects of pride. You can even find a Croix de Guerre which most likely belongs to Andre as it first appeared in the First World War. Rather than displaying it proudly, it feels like Andre kept it out of obligation rather than affection. On the other hand, these objects have all been stored away rather than thrown out or sold. This implies that the objects still matter enough to Andre for him to keep them. How complicated must his feelings be when it comes to these objects? He wants to forget them, but perhaps he also feels that they are too significant for what they represent. Regardless, it is doubtful that the importance of these objects will be passed down much further in the family. In time, the objects may remain, but all the stories, all the personal and impersonal tragedies attached to them, will disappear with the people who remember them. The last few journal entries cover what happened when the Second World War began. When the war was declared, Andre became so angry that he compulsively paced up and down the house despite having a broken ankle. By the end of 1939, Andre has become withdrawn and sick. Those more idealistically inclined men used to call the First World War the war to end wars. Of course, that was wishful thinking, but it would still be very distressing news to hear that your nation has entered another huge war. Doubly so if you have terrible memories of the previous one. Now Andre is confronted by the prospect that it will all happen again. But there's one more important reason why Andre reacts the way he does to the Second World War. In the final flashback sequence of the game, Andre and Pierre are collected by a truck for conscription. Here you conclude this ending sequence the very same way. Andre's son has been conscripted into the Second World War. Andre has a very good idea of what war is likely to do to his son. If he ever returns, it's questionable if he will return whole. Even though Andre never passed on the previous generation's reverence for military tradition, it seems his son is doomed to suffer through war just as he did, continuing a tragic legacy. I think Conscript is special. It's one of the strongest examples I've seen of environmental and thematic storytelling in games. Many games tell you that war is horrible, but that's hardly a profound observation. Conscript shows how war damages not only places and bodies, but also relationships and even futures without ever becoming preachy. It shows you war as legacy rather than just a terrible event that happens. And perhaps that's what makes Conscript so haunting. Not the war itself, but what remains after it ends.
Let's get ready for another try! Get these men out of here! I tried 3 times, look at all the casualties! All right! Let's give it another try! Come on! Let's give it another try!